G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. Today, a panel with two of the most illustrious and thoughtful Australian commentators. Claire Lehmann is the editor of Quillette, the online magazine of big ideas, and Peter van Onselen is the political editor of Daily Mail Australia and a political professor at the University of Western Australia. G'day Claire, g'day Peter.
Hey Josh.
Good to be here.
Twitter's at war with the Australian government. Can we call it Twitter? Is that all right? Do I have to call it X?
Well,
what do you do, Claire?
Is anyone ever going to call it X?
I call it Twitter.
Yeah, I call it Twitter. All right. So Australia's e-safety commissioner, which is actually a real role if you're not in Australia, there is an e-safety commissioner, which Elon likes to call like an Australian censorship commissar. That's what he calls it, a commissar of censorship. They took Twitter to court to try to force the company to take down about 60 instances of footage of the stabbing of a bishop in a church attack. That happened 2 days after the Bondi stabbing. And at the time, Twitter agreed to geo-block the posts so that Australian users couldn't see them. But it refused the ruling from the e-safety commissioner to remove them altogether from Twitter. That would have had a global effect. And Elon Musk said that the Australian censorship commissar was demanding global content bans. And X released an official statement saying that the order was not within the scope of Australian law. Now, what's happened this week is that the federal court has basically given Elon an early win. It has rejected the Australian government's request to extend the temporary order for Twitter to hide videos of the terrorist stabbing globally until a proper court date resolves the issue once and for all in a few weeks' time. Claire, this is like one of those issues that keeps coming up all over the world. Like, are social media platforms right to resist government censorship of things that they put on their platform or that users do, or are governments right to rein in extreme content?
Yeah, well, extreme content's a broad term, but I think in this situation I'm definitely with Elon because, it was a real event. It happened. The footage was not confected by some AI-generated tool, and the Australian government has no right to tell social media users around the world what they can and can't watch. And I would argue that they don't have a right to censor true content in Australia either. I think the role that governments can have or should have is enforcing these companies to have strict rules around false content, such as AI-generated content and, malicious lies.
What if it's real but horrible and grisly and offensive to the people who were affected, like the GoPro video of the Christchurch shooter walking in and massacring people or something?
Well, there's going to be edge cases in all of these situations. But, we all saw the George Floyd video, right? That was a video of someone being killed. And we saw that was played on the ABC News Bulletin. Should we have seen it? I think we should have. I think if it's a real event and it's true factual content, adults should have a right to see it.
Right. Peter?
I'm really torn about this. I mean, the old me in decades gone by, pre-social media, but even when the internet was considered a new thing, was a rabid civil libertarian and advocate for everything from free speech to free content.
You were with me reading your Ayn Rand when you were 15 years old.
I was really big on all this stuff, and I sort of saw it as the personification of the small L liberal in me. Fast forward to where we are now, I'm less sure about that because I just worry about just how free and open social media makes things and how much it sort of panders to the grizzly. Having said all of that, though, I'm critical of the government for inconsistency on these sort of things. It's we for example, why don't they chase down and find ways to geo-block this incredibly over the top online pornography, for example, which they could do, but they just choose not to do it. If that's how they feel about these sort of examples in social media. And I also feel like there's an inconsistency now with government where you've got to be careful about the overreach in other ways. For example, once upon a time, it was a big deal to violate some basic civil liberties in the name of national defence or whatever it might be, but now it happens all the time. We're now even talking about not even having the right to economically think that there are, positives to engagement with countries that might be deemed security threats to Australia. So I'm critical of the inconsistency on the side of the government, but I do worry about that kind of content being out there. And I also wonder, where do you draw the line, though? I mean, Claire, you mentioned something like the sort of content that might be false. But then, what about the subjective definition of false? That worries me.
Well, yeah, we saw that during the pandemic as well. Like, how much do you turn up or down the volume on, I don't know, people who are saying that vaccines might cause injuries or something?
Well, I mean, what I meant by false information is actual, like AI generated, like fake videos of people doing, photoshopping someone's head into like pornography, that kind of thing. Like, actually, completely fabricated types of videos and images, because I mean they're already proliferating online, and I do think governments have a role in making these big companies regulate or enforce strict rules about what content is available. I just think that violent material is available online. We can watch things like ISIS videos. We can watch the horrible videos coming out of Gaza. We can watch videos.
We can, but should they be delivered algorithmically and pushed out?
Well, that's a separate issue. That's a separate issue. The algorithm in making content go viral could be regulated, right? We could ask these companies to dampen down the virality of content while being content
that would be perceived
neutral.
as even more of an attack on free speech.
I think it's all just such a problem. I just wish we lived in the old days. Remember the wonderful old days when we only had the internet, but we didn't have social media yet?
Or before that, when Walter Cronkite told us what we should think. But free speech people find themselves, and I suppose I'll put myself in that camp as well, in a real pickle here, because you want freedom of speech, and that sometimes means that you see offensive content, or you get upset by someone else's opinion or a video of something. On the other hand, the existence of the algorithm constantly favouring content that is going to agitate you means that it's not free speech. It's speech that's tampered
speech
with and amplified and contorted through the prism of what the algorithm thinks is going to get you riled up and keep you commenting and sharing and liking and getting angry or feeling reinforced or demonising people you disagree with, or pandering to what you already believe. And so it's tricky for me. I mean, I sometimes open up a social media app and there'll be some horrifying video of something from Gaza, and I'm like I get it. I know there's a war going on. Like, wars are bad. I don't necessarily need that over my Wheat-Bix in the morning.
That's just the algorithm, Joshua, based on what you've been looking at.
That's right. I think they've seen that all my disaster porn is coming back to haunt me. I don't know. I mean, assuming that we all agree that fake videos should be clamped down on, what should the rules be that the e-Safety Commissioner enforces? Like, what should the rationale be? Should it be that this is going to cause significant distress to people? Should it be...
But where do you draw the line on that?
Well,
that's
exactly.
so subjective more than anything, isn't it?
Well, I mean, you can now use AI tools to decipher whether something else has been artificially generated.
Yeah, but forget the fake stuff. I'm just talking about the real stuff, like the actual video of a bishop being stabbed while he's giving a sermon in a church, or people being mown down in a mosque or something. Like, are we not okay with governments saying you got to take that stuff down like that?
I'm okay with governments keeping out of it. I worry. I think it's a slippery slope when governments try and censor information that is true. Like, it's just real. It's a real event that happened. And
so what if leave it up to the
what if a journalist overseas wants to report on that incident and wants to view the material? Like, I think there are other legitimate uses of that content rather than just fomenting extremism and agitating people.
Yeah, but I mean, well, then where is the line? Because presumably a snuff film's too bad, right? Or the Christchurch shooter mowing down people in a mosque is too bad, or not?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Was the George Floyd video a snuff film?
Good question.
I don't know. I don't know where the line is. There should be a line, but I think I'm not sure.
It'd be good if we had ways of deciding it that didn't depend on the whims of Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg on the one hand, or e-safety commissioners on the other.
Well, in that sort of dichotomy, I probably somewhat uncomfortably fall on the side generally of the e-Safety Commissioner rather than it being randomly decided by, sort of moguls or whatever types who own particular investments. I don't like it. I wish that we didn't end up in the situation we're in now, but as a lesser of evils, I'd probably go for someone who is, at least in a qualification sense, seen to be good at their job and appointed there based on past experience to make, sort of recommendations at the very least. Maybe there needs to be a ratification process beyond the commissioner.
Could you have a tribunal or something? Could you have really well-educated people from across a number of different fields who
It gets
debate
complicated
that
though,
stuff?
doesn't it?
But even then, the tribunal in Australia cannot dictate the terms to the world, right?
And that's very good.
And
But isn't that what we will find out in court in a couple of weeks' time? They obviously don't have the jurisdictional authority to do so, but they could penalise Twitter in Australia in ways that Twitter would want to avoid, and therefore Twitter can voluntarily comply with the Australian law.
Yeah, but we're such a tiny market. Like, we're irrelevant. There's no way Australia could do anything that would harm Twitter, Twitter's business model. Like, that they just, block us from being able to use it if push came to shove.
And the risks of that, imagine the devastation to us as a country
if we didn't have Twitter.
Deserted us.
I'm not sure about that, Claire. Although we're a small fraction of Twitter's global profits, I think it would only become... I think we're a sufficiently prized medium-sized market that Elon would only remove Twitter from Australia if he was trying to make a point because his ego was bruised. I think if there was a face-saving way for him to keep it, all things being equal, he'd rather have Australia as part of the group of...
I reckon we're pretty tiny and irrelevant.
Well, as far as English-speaking democracies go, it's us and Canada basically, and then New Zealand and Ireland are us and Canada and the UK.
But if there was this kind of conflict with India, that would be a significant issue,
right? Yes,
but we just don't have the population or the heft to be able to command that much concern.
And I suppose
attention.
picking a fight with Elon is always only going to go one way because he's going to hunker down and feel aggrieved. Meanwhile, Australia has a new budget. Budget night in Australia was this week. Budget night is sort of like a cross between the State of the Union in the United States and a Democratic or Republican convention. It's an opportunity for journalists and politicians to hobnob at fancy dinners at Parliament House, while the government of the day lays out its intentions for the coming financial year, which weirdly in Australia begins on the 1st of July. Not quite sure why. Peter, you wrote about this. You're the political editor of the Daily Mail. What did you make of Budget Night?
Well, it's always a version of what we saw this year, but the Labor Party ramped it up in terms of the fundraising glitz and glamour side of Budget Night. Normally there is a dinner in the Parliament House that's thousands of dollars a head, and it's largely corporate tables, and it's a fundraiser for whichever political party is lucky enough to be in government and therefore hand down the budget. This year they had two. The business elite went to a dinner at the Realm Hotel, which is a 5-star hotel just down the road from the Parliament. $5,000 a head was the price if you wanted to sit there and have an overcooked steak.
Yeah, you want that to be some good lobster, wouldn't you?
The plebeians of the business community had a $1,500 a head cocktail stand-up drinks function, I'm told, at the Parliament House.
Does that money go to the political party?
It does.
How outrageous.
And, well, particularly given that sometimes they're paying either no or peppercorn rent for the premises on the Parliament that they rent.
That's like, remember there was a huge brouhaha in the States when Bill Clinton allowed people to stay in the Lincoln bedroom and they were donors, and there was Republicans were going crazy because he's basically turning the White House into a bed and breakfast. This is that. This is doing the same thing. You're using a public space just because you're in government in order to line your own party coffers.
And it's even worse than that, using public office to line the party's coffers. So government ministers can be sold off at political fundraisers for dinners or, one-on-one meetings and so forth in a way that shadow ministers, people stuck in the opposition, not in power, they get a lot less money. So both sides do it. Right. They're as bad as each other. And I think the public would be surprised at the amount of time politicians have to spend on political fundraising. And they hate it too, by the way, just to be clear.
Americans would be surprised because it's so little time in comparison.
Yeah, that's true.
In America, Australian politicians don't have to spend a lot of time.
Well, we are unbelievable. We have 3-year terms, unlike, the House of Representatives over there that only has 2-year terms. It's unbelievable, their electoral cycle. But look, Budget Night was just like it always is in that sense. But that's the pomp and the ceremony of it. But what about the content of what the government wants to do? You wanted to know about what's actually in the budget.
You are the political editor, right? Not the fashion editor.
My mistake. Look, the interesting thing for me, and this is a little bit of a process issue, but it does go to some of the content. There was all this talk about the surplus of $9.3 billion leading up to the budget that was leaked prior by the government. Normally they talk about the coming financial year. That's the budget. the spending, what is the surplus or the deficit in the coming financial year.
Right.
That surplus is this financial year.
Wait, what?
It's over in 6 weeks. The surplus or budget for the next financial year, which is normally everything that everyone talks about, is actually almost $30 billion and then almost $50 billion the year after that. That's where all the spending is that people are talking about.
Wait,
this future fund
there's
for
a huge
Australia.
surplus next year?
No, that's a deficit.
A deficit.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry.
Okay.
I mean, I'm amazed that you said that, because it means that political journalists have done a terrible job in the wake of the budget, because all I've seen is that, Australia's in surplus, Australia's in surplus.
Well,
What
for
that
6
means
more
to-
weeks.
Yeah, what that means to me is that in the next financial year, which is what the budget references, we will be in surplus.
No, we're
But you're
not.
saying that they're talking about it retroactively, and then they're going to run up the red ink again next year.
It is a two-step trick by the government, and hats off to them for getting away with it by and large, because that's the way that a lot of the reporting has covered this. And if you think about it, it's no surprise that we're not in surplus next year or the year after and
Why?
so forth, because of the amount of spending that has also
Right, but
been
why
reported
wasn't there
in this
lots of
budget.
spending this year?
Well, they just had a windfall with terms of trade. So, commodity prices.
And the low Australian dollar?
Exactly. All of that has come. I think it was Ken Henry, former Treasury Secretary here, called it, dumb luck that Australia has faced, which is a critique of both sides, because he was throwing that criticism
We
in
get a
both
lot
directions.
of dumb luck in Australia. I mean,
Yeah.
for people who don't know, who aren't Australian, Australia's nickname to Aussies is the lucky country. And, a lot of people use that term as a badge of honour or kind of some kind of pride. Oh, we're the lucky country, mate. Not realising that when Donald Horne coined the phrase, he actually meant it as a criticism, that we have the dumb luck of living in such a beautiful, vast, mineral-rich, agriculturally fertile.
Yeah, I think he wrote a bunch of
landmass.
second raters, who just stumbled ass backwards into good luck.
Exactly, and we've never actually tapped our ingenuity or tried to excel in the fields which matter. But yeah, so lucky country, lucky year, lots of money, and next year we're going to spend it all on what, Peter?
Well, next year it's getting spent on a lot of its recurrent expenditure, which is why we're in a structural deficit going forward, not just an actual one. So the NDIS blowout is pretty big.
That's that's about a decades-old scheme that Labor introduced, which gives money to people living with a disability, but it has
And
become...
how fast is it growing?
It's grown at about
incredible
9.5%, so
Every
3
year.
times inflation almost.
Wow.
It's a staggering, eye-watering amount of money, and it's put upward pressure on demand. So, like, mental health services are just straining. You can't get an appointment without waiting for 6 months because everyone's got free money to spend on.
And it's very politically hard to talk about wanting to cut disability spending. But part of the problem is, particularly for people with acute disabilities who need it most, and very few people would argue against them getting something if the government can afford it. The problem is that the ambit of what is qualifying is what's causing problems. Now, Bill Shorten is the minister responsible for this. He was actually, 2 governments ago, the minister or thereabouts responsible for the idea and the original sort of conceptualization of this NDIS. He's suddenly having to rein it in. He's not reining it in as much as he was spruiking he was going to before the budget, but that's a big spending item. There's also this whole idea of trying to spend money on made in Australia products. That's, I think, $25 billion over the next 10 years. There's more money going into aged care, which was something that they committed to doing. But there's also handouts through things like energy rebates going forward and that sort of thing. A bit of a technical point, but a big disagreement at the moment is the forecasts for inflation that the Treasury have put in versus what were those forecasts for inflation that were put out by the Independent Reserve Bank. They differ, and some economists think that the government has been a little bit tricky with its forecasting, keeping it lower than what the Reserve Bank says inflation is going to be because it politically suits them to say it's going to be lower.
Because if inflation is higher, then the amounts that they have to pay on welfare go up because they're pegged to inflation?
It changes all those estimates going forward, and it also puts more pressure on them in terms of questions about, well, why are you spending what you're spending?
Oh, I see.
Because inflation's already high and you're stoking it to
stimulating
potentially go further.
The economy even more. I mean, just before we leave the National Disability Insurance Scheme, I used to have regular conversations on my ABC show with the head of Autism Australia, and I would, like, for example, I think 1 in 5 boys of primary school age are now receiving National Disability Insurance Scheme money for treatment of attention deficit disorders and stuff like that. Like, and
it's not even that it's developmental delay. So it's not even a DSM diagnosis. Like anybody up to age 7 can be slightly delayed in any domain, whether it's language, social skills, emotional maturity. that qualifies as getting an NDIS participation.
Right.
And, people who actually work in the disability sector warned that this was a bad idea and it would lead to a blowout of participants, and that has been what's happened.
I mean, I suppose the idea is that you catch it early before they're 7 by letting people do it for free. And basically the way the NDIS works, if people don't know, I mean, you just get an account with a bunch of money in it and you then get to spend that on approved providers. So, you might just get assigned $16,000 or something from the federal government, and it sits there and you can spend it on the providers that you see fit. But the autism guy was basically saying that there's no doubt in his mind that the huge increase in diagnoses of autism and attention deficit disorders in Australia is linked to the ability to
funding.
Funding. I mean, of course, because if your kid is just a little off, and as you say, if they don't actually meet the diagnostic threshold for having a condition, but who doesn't want support if they could have support? Who wouldn't want their 6-year-old who's a little bit behind to have the opportunity to see a therapist if it was going to help them, an occupational therapist or something? So if you can, you do, and then you go into the diagnostic system.
The problem is that this funding gives people an incentive, or even families an incentive, not to get better. Because if you get better, you lose your funding, right? And so there's this sort of perverse incentive to present yourself as the most disabled, the most unwell version of yourself, and that is potentially bad for the people who are receiving the funding.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, it can form a kind of dependency or a weird.
Because if you actually look at the data of the NDIS, because they publish their own data, people don't come off packages. The packages increase by about 30% a year. And we have, when the NDIS was originally launched, we heard all of these aspirational goals, like it would get people into the economy, people would work jobs, it would help people get better. But disability, if it's a long-term disability, firstly, it doesn't get better. We can improve people's quality of life, which is what, we should be doing. But people don't get better from serious disability. And then when it comes to children who have delays, we don't actually want to encourage them to think that they're actually disabled. We want them to just grow out of the delay, whatever it is, and then just get on with being,
But presumably they're better able to grow out of the delay if they have assistance.
Absolutely. But that was traditionally the responsibility of the education system. And, we've got Medicare, we've got these other institutions that help with things like developmental delay, lumping it in with the NDIS and then taking away guardrails, like spending guardrails. That was the thing that disability workers warned would be a bad idea, and it's leading to this blowout.
That's the biggest concern I've got, is that too many people are getting classified in the NDIS that should be classified as part of the broader. Australia has universal healthcare, so part of the broader Medicare scheme, and it is a consequence of too many getting classified as being in need of NDIS. The real acute end of need is not getting what it needs, and yet, despite that, the funding is blowing out the way that it is. And so it needs to be. I think most people, when they were incredibly supportive of the concept of the NDIS when it first was getting mooted in those years ago, and there were polls around it, I think people were thinking of acute disability.
Yeah, right.
And they wanted that addressed, because this idea that somebody could be confined to a wheelchair or have incredibly severe mental health issues that were impinging on their life, the Australian public wanted those people to not be left behind.
And we regard it as part of the Australian ethos. We're not Americans who pride ourselves on rugged individualism. We're all about giving people a fair go and, uplifting the least among us, and we're much more egalitarian that way. It strikes to the heart of what it means to be an Australian, to go, you know what, if you've had a bad lot, if you've been dealt a bad hand, then you deserve our care.
If you're on the NDIS, should you be able to spend NDIS money on sex workers?
Well, that's a whole other question. Because
and cruises. Because,
can you?
Yeah, you can.
You can. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
On sex workers?
Yeah, believe it or not, the government doesn't like talking about it, but the questions have started to be asked.
I mean, a lot of Americans will be listening to this going, wait, sex work is legal in Australia? Yeah, it is.
Let's get to that as well, shall we?
Prostitution is legal in Australia and regulated, which is a great thing, because it makes life so much safer for sex workers. But so that you can... Why? Because it's your mental health that's being improved?
If you attach it to your program's goals, So I did some reading about this because I included it in a column. And so there's an organisation called Touching Base who put out a guide for sex workers on how to invoice their clients, their disabled clients. Now, I have absolutely...
To hear the rest of this conversation, go to uncomfortableconversations.substack.com/listen and you will get your own personal premium podcast feed with at least 3 extra episodes of the podcast every month and heaps of extra stuff, including the remainder right now of the fabulous conversation you've just been hearing. If it was worth listening to this much of, don't rob yourself of the rest. Pull out your phone right now and search for Uncomfortable Conversations on Substack.